Why are these not super impressive looking commons doing so well in Ixalan Limited? Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I've been planning the State of the Format address episode that will be coming later this week. I was writing notes for it today, and I planned to have a section just talking about a handful of cards in this set that don't look that impressive, cards that I've got a lot of questions about this week on stream, asking, hey, why is this card good? I saw in 17 lands that Cogwork Wrestler is one of the top performing commons in the set. Same with Etali's Favor. What's going on there? There seems to be a lot of cards in this set that are kind of puzzling, kind of baffling to some people. It's tricky to wrap your head around why these cards are performing so well. So that's what this video is today. A little bit of a shorter video. If you've been wondering, hey, should I be picking Etali's Favor a little bit higher? Well, I got some answers for you. Let's jump into it. I got about maybe 6, 7, 8 cards to cover today. I'm sure going to be covering more on the State of the Format episode. So let's jump in. So first thing I want to say about all these cards is I do believe these are generically good cards. The cards we're going to talk about today. It's not like you have to draft some weird deck around them. It's not like there's something that some players are doing that are making it appear way better in the stats than it actually are. Kind of the opposite, actually. When early format stats come out, the top cards in the format that you see on 17 lands are sort of like the foolproof cards, right? The cards that if you just put them in your deck, they're going to perform pretty well because nobody really knows what's going on the first week of the format. They're just trying out cards. So just the raw sheer number of games that are played, people just putting these cards in their deck and how do they perform, that kind of comes out in the wash and the cream of the crop rises to the top. And you get a bunch of cards that you might not have expected to be performing well if, you're not super in tune to why these cards might be good. So let's start off with Etali's Favor. So this is the 2 and a red aura. When it enters the battlefield, you discover 3, and the enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has trample. So definitely a weird card on first glance, right? Auras are always kind of weird because when you first learn about limited magic, you're like, oh, auras are bad because your opponent casts a removal spell on the aura. You lose the creature and the aura. Definitely true, but they've done a lot of things to kind of remedy that in the last few years with auras. They've either made them hyper efficient or, like in the case of Etali's Favor here, giving you an enter the battlefield effect. So even if your creature dies after you resolve this, you get a little bit of value. So with Etali's Favor, I do want to point out, especially for those who don't keep track of the stats or don't go on 17 lands that often, this is the top performing red common, above the common creatures, above a Braid even. And I'm not claiming that Etali's Favor is necessarily better than a Braid. There's some confounding factors going in where people, of course, take a Braid a lot higher than Etali's Favor. Etali's Favor wheels some amount of the time, and if you have to spend a 3rd pick on a Braid, and you can get Etali's Favor 12th pick or something, well, the 12th pick card, if it's a good card, is going to have a higher win rate because you get it for free. You don't have to spend a very early pick on it like you would with a Braid. But at the same time, it's not just a fluke that Etali's Favor is performing so well. It's not just like, oh, you get this card late, so of course it's gonna be a little bit higher in the stats than some other cards. No, there's a lot of cards that go late. This one still happens to be performing very well. So what's going on here? Well, I think there's a few things. Number one, this card is less of an aura and more of a creature that gives a creature +1/+1. I've kind of likened it to Red Tooth Genealogist from the last set, the 3 mana 2/3 that comes in and gives a royal roll to something. And that was a card a lot of people were pretty excited about in Wild of Eldringans before we actually started playing the set. Turns out that there weren't actually a ton of good green 2-drops at the common level, and a lot of times your green decks didn't actually want to play a creature on turn 2. They were playing something else. They were setting up their mana. And so what happened was, well, Genealogist didn't have a great target a lot of the time, and it wasn't great. It was good in like a red-green deck where you often had an attacking 2-drop, but it just didn't perform as one of the better commons because of how the green decks wanted to play. Etali's Favor, while being a very similar card in form and function, plays much better because in this set, red is just straight up attacking like it is in a lot of sets. You have 1-drops you want to play. You have 2-drops. So just first and foremost, this card is going to have a target a little more often than something like Red Tooth Genealogist, just based on how the decks are constructed in their given formats. Now let's talk about how this card actually plays out. So like I alluded to, what's going to happen is you're going to play your 1-drop, your Goblin Tome Raider, you're going to play your 2-drop, and then on turn 3, you play Etali's Favor on one of them. Maybe you put it on an evasive 1-drop that you had, or maybe you put it on a 2/2 creature that turns to a 3/3, and a 3/3 attacker is going to be able to attack past your opponent's creatures, even if you're on the draw, which is kind of nice, right? One of the little problems sometimes when you're an aggro deck on the draw is they play a 3 mana 3/3. When you play a 2 mana 2/2, you're looking to attack, and it's like, oh, I can't get through that, right? It's just the difference between being on the play and the draw. But of course, I want to draw our attention to the Discover 3 text, because that's really what you're playing this card for. So like Red Tooth Genealogist is a 2/3 that comes and gives something +1/+1. Etali's Favor is sort of the same thing, but it's not obvious that it's that. what I mean by that is when you cast Etali's Favor, of course, you're going to have a creature +1/+1 and trample, but you're going to discover 3, which will most often hit a 2 or 3 drop creature. Sometimes it hits a removal spell or a combat trick, and you can put that in your hand, and it's not quite as good. Sometimes it hits a 1-drop, but I wouldn't even feel too bad about hitting like a 1-drop flyer or something. Most of the time, you're going to get a pretty good 2 or 3 mana card. And if you hit a 3 mana card, you're up on the exchange big time. Like, you've kind of spiked playing this card, right? There's a range. You could hit a 1, you could hit a 3. If you hit a 3-drop, sometimes you just really start to take over the game because you go, Etali's Favor on my 2/2. Etali's Favor discovers, you hit like a Plundering Pirate, right? The 3/2 that makes a treasure. Now you've played a 3/2 creature, and this is what it amounts to. You played a 3-mana 3/2 creature that makes a treasure, and also gave one of your creatures +1/+1 and trample. That's just a ton for 3 mana. And just to make a quick comparison to Redtooth Genealogist, I think most of the 3 and 2 drops in this set are better than a vanilla 2/3. Like, even the 2 drops, you have stuff like the Wanderglyph, the 2 mana 2/2 in red that attacks, and you can discard a card and draw a card, and that's just like an artifact, and it's a good 2 drop, and sometimes you'll hit an evasive creature. I just think most of the 2 mana creatures in the set are better than vanilla 2/3, right? So that's just kind of another way you can think about it, how Etali's Favor lines up favorably versus Redtooth Genealogist. And the beauty of it is Etali's Favor plays very well with additional copies of itself. I'm sure you've experienced this, or maybe you haven't just yet. The format's pretty new. If you just cast an Etali's Favor and hit another Etali's Favor, you can just keep going, right? Discover 3, hits another Etali's Favor. The most Etali's Favor I've chained before is 3. I haven't gone higher than that, but I have heard tales of people hitting like 4 and 5. That's not typical, of course, but I just want to point this out because I don't think multiples are a bad idea, and I actually think multiples are good. And usually when I'm talking about a common I want to take early or a top common, playing well in multiples is good so that you don't feel like diminishing returns when you see a bunch of them later in the draft. I also want to call attention to the trample. Trample's a pretty good deal. You know, just if you compare the Royal Roll to the Monstrous Roll from Wilds of Eldraine, well, the Monstrous Roll was quite a bit better, I would say, than the Royal Roll. And this set, I think, even makes better use of trample because the big green creatures in the set are really, really massive, and there's a lot of combat tricks and equipment and ways to augment your creatures that often get played. So all parts of this card, I like. Where do I think you should draft this? Well, I think most players should probably draft this higher than they are right now. I would say, especially now that the word is getting out, you're not going to see Etali's Favors wheeling very often. You're going to have to take them somewhere in the middle of the pack, even early on in the pack, picks 1, 2, 3, if the pack isn't that strong. And I would feel good about that, right? I was making the comparison from a Braid and Etali's Favor, and sure, I will take a Braid early because everybody else tends to, and you can't rely on getting them late. But I wouldn't be too sad about taking Favor early out of that weak pack, and wouldn't be sad about picking up multiples. So yeah, really good card. The stats don't lie. Basically, I've had a really good experience with this card, and I think you should just draft this card and count it as just a good card in your deck. Of course, the caveat to this is you do still want a lot of 2-drops and a lot of 1-drops, so that you can cast this card on turn 3, but most of your red decks are going to have that. Next up, we've got the card that I've certainly been asked questions about the most this week, and this is Cogwork Wrestler. Single blue mana for a 1/2 flash artifact creature gnome. When it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -2, -0 until end of turn. So there's a lot of things to like about this card, and I think it's certainly underrated. It goes close to last pick some amount of the time. And again, you got that thing with Etali's Favor where the later a card's going to go, the better it's going to perform on the 17 land stats, but not hugely, right? It's going to be marginal. So yes, it's probably a little bit overinflated considering people don't value this card highly at all right now. But again, the card is just, people are putting it in their decks and it's performing very well. So why is that? So I think there's a few things at play here. Number one, I think the main thing is people aren't tuned into the fact that this effect usually plays out pretty well. The single blue mana, make something small and give me a small creature. We've seen this quite a few times at this point, and almost always, there are some exceptions you can point to, but almost always, this type of card overperforms. The last time we saw this was Deceive the Messenger in Lord of the Rings, and that was one of Blue's better commons as well. So if you're puzzled by the Cogwork Wrestler here, I would just make a mental note that if you see this kind of card in the future, these are just good cards. Like, you can just put this into your bank of, yeah, I like this kind of card in Limited. And why is it good? Why do these cards perform well? Well, another issue I think is at play here is people have a hard time evaluating efficiency. A 1-mana card is such a, being a 1-mana card is such a nice quality for a card to have, a very powerful quality. Obviously, you can't fit as much power into a 1-mana card as you could for a 2 or a 3-mana card, but these days, they're giving you like 1.5 worth of mana out of your 1 mana cards. They really want you to play the 1 mana cards, and this one is no exception. So just, I'm looking at this card as, yeah, it is a 1 mana card, and the text box doesn't seem that impressive, but you get quite a bit for your 1 mana. What do you get? You get 1/2 worth of stats. All right, not that impressive, but that -2 is a really big deal, because what does that mean? Well, it means that you can counter a fight spell. Most often, you can win a combat. And when you attack your 2/2 into your opponent's 2/2, and then you go cast Cogwork Wrestler, your opponent feels really awful about that, right? You've spent 1 mana to kill their creature in combat, you effectively cast a 1 mana combat trick, and you've gotten a 1/2. Maybe another way to evaluate this card is, think of this as an instant, right? Single blue mana, make a 1/2, target creature gets -2, -0 until end turn. Maybe that looks like a more appealing card to a lot of people. But there's a lot of game states that this effect is going to be good in. I mentioned the combat trick, I mentioned being good against a fight spell. It's also good in a race where your opponent doesn't know that you have this flash blocker and that you're virtually gaining 2 life, right? It also works when your opponent goes for a combat trick. Maybe they're the one lining up their 3/3 against your 3/3, and they give a +1/+1 combat trick, or put an Etali's favor on it. Well, this Cogwork Wrestler is going to stop that. So there's just, I'm illustrating all these situations that this card is good in, and I really want to bring it back to, this is a super hyper efficient card, and you should be looking for the 1-drops, for the 1-drops that give you a little bit more than what you might expect for your 1 mana. I can't really hammer home enough how good efficiency is in the game of Magic, especially in limited Magic, where these days where it does go, games are a little bit quicker paced. And the other thing about this card that, of course, I haven't mentioned is it's an artifact, right? So you can craft with it. It counts for all of the things that care about artifacts. You can hit it off of your staunch crewmates that look at the top 4, take an artifact or a pirate. A lot of little things. So, number 1, efficiency, really want to highlight that. But number 2, these style of cards are good. Try them out, put them in your deck. I think it requires a little bit of actually playing with these cards to really have it click for you. Like, I can tell you, yeah, this plays up pretty well, but until you end up in those situations where you're like, oh wow, I just get to eat my opponent's 2 or 3 drop with this Cogwork Wrestler, that's great. Mind you, you can also just eat their 3/1s. They attack with a 3 mana 3/1, and there's a few of those in the set. This just kills that straight up, because it makes it a 1/1, and you can block with it as a 1/2. So really good card. I'd be happy playing 1 or 2. Again, I don't think you have to take it that highly, because people still don't value it. But after next week, when people really start to get tuned into the format, you're going to probably have to take this card a little higher. Next up, we've got Unlucky Drop. This is a 3 and a blue instant, puts a artifact or creature on the top or bottom of the owner's library of their choosing. And this is another card that I would really just like to hammer home, like this template of blue, put something on top of my opponent's library, or they get to choose. These cards tend to just be good. And I've talked about this kind of card, this template of card, a lot in the past, the Griptide variants, for those who've been playing a while and have actually played with the OG Griptide. And I apologize if you've heard me go on and on about this kind of card, but I'm going to keep going on and on about it until people, the collective conscious is, yeah, these are just pretty good cards. Now, just like Cogwork Wrestler, there have been versions of this effect here and there that have underperformed for various reasons. I mean, heck, we just saw misleading motes in Wild of Eldraine, and that was probably the worst this kind of card has been. But, in general, when you have a 4 mana instant that just gets rid of something, even if it's just for a turn, that means you're blanking your opponent's draw step, right? Even if they choose to put it on top, they're not drawing a new card. So your baseline for this card, I think, should just be a pretty good removal spell. You don't want to take too many early. It is still a 4-drop removal spell, but it's got a lot of the things I'm looking for a 4-drop removal spell in being an instant and targeting anything, right? There's Rumbling Rock Slide in this set. The 3 in a red, deal damage to target creature equal to the number of lands you control. I think a lot of people think that card's probably a lot better, but I really dislike that card because it doesn't always kill what you need it to kill, and it's not an instant, and it's still 4 mana, right? I think maybe there's a bit of a mental block of, oh, but they get their card back next turn, they get their creature back. Remember, you're not always going to be targeting some awesome bomb that you want to get rid of for good. Sometimes you're just going to be targeting their 4-drop creature that they've maybe invested in equipment in, or an aura, or they go for a combat trick or something. It's still going to do the removal thing of, oh wow, I've really blown you out on tempo when your opponent goes for one of those things. And because blue is aggressive in this set, you're often playing cheap flyers and really trying to tempo them out. This kind of effect plays pretty well because it's not like your blue decks are trying to play a 12-turn game where it's like, oh, I'm going to have to deal with that thing eventually. They're just going, nope, put that on top, I hit you for 7, and sure, you can draw the next turn, but I don't really care, I'm going to kill you, right? So the aggressive nature of blue definitely makes Unlucky Drop a little bit better. It also matters in the set that a lot of the games revolve around suiting up your creatures with equipment or ways to augment them, which means that, once again, the mana that your opponents have invested gets kind of undone when you cast Unlucky Drop in Wilds of Eldraine, and that's where this card has not been particularly good. The problem with it has been, mostly, in my opinion, that, well, two problems. One, if the boards go really wide in formats, this card's not as good, because if there's not one thing that's like holding your entire board back and then you get it out of the way and you can attack, well, it's not really doing as much as you'd like it to. But two, when the cheap threats are the things you want to kill, or, you know, the cheap threats are the things that really are going to dictate how the game goes, Unlucky Drop gets a little bit worse. And yes, there's certainly a lot of good 1s and 2s in this set, but often the real inflection point of the games in this format, I feel, comes on like turn 4 when somebody slams a really good blocking creature that then threatens to attack back, or they do start to suit up their small flyer. And you get this point where, yes, it doesn't trade up on mana with a 1 or a 2 drop, but often the thing that you're going to want to target at this point of the game either is worth 4 mana, or you get into one of those situations where your opponent has put a bunch of mana into it, or they cast a trick, or whatever, you know, all those things that I mentioned. So it's a bit of a weird card. Again, just like Cogwork Wrestler, I think unless you really play this card and put it in your deck and feel how it actually feels, it might be hard to get over the hump of like, oh, this isn't real quote-unquote removal, but it is in the context of a game that's about tempo, right? I also want to point out Jason ILTG's tweet here. I've had Jason on the podcast before, but some neat tricks you can do with Unlucky Drop. Number one, you can cast it in response to an Explore trigger. So say you notice your opponent's missing a land drop, well, you get to top one of their cards, and if they want to find a land, they have to put that card in the graveyard that you just topped. So a little bit of synergy there. You can also drop in response to a Discover spell that maybe has Discover 3, let's say, and you've targeted a 4-drop with Unlucky Drop. Well, they're going to Discover trigger on the stack, cast Unlucky Drop, put that 4-drop on top. Well, they're going to Discover 3, which means that 4-drop is now going to the bottom. So it's just a hard removal spell at that point. And of course, you can also drop in response to a shuffle effect like a Land Cycler, or your opponent cracking their Promised Vein. And all good ways to just get a little more value out of Unlucky Drop. But I think you should be quite happy with the first copy in all of your blue decks, and the second in the decks that are quite aggressive. Like if your top end is just 2 Unlucky Drops and maybe a few other things in the 4 and 5 drop slot, and your 1s and 2s and 3s are just loaded, you know, I'm thinking like a blue-red artifact aggro deck, you're very happy to have this as your curb topper. Next up, we've got a collection of cards here, and it is the cheap 1-mana Flyers. You see these in blue and white. We've got Spyglass Siren, which is the blue 1/1 that makes a map token. Rune Lurker Bat, which is the white 1/1 lifelink flying that if you've descended at your end step, you can scry 1. And Miner's Guidewing, 1-mana 1/1 flying vigilance that when it dies, target creature you control explores. So generally, these 1-mana 1/1 flyers with a little bit of an ability, these tend to be good cards. Right? I'm really just, with what we're talking about today, a lot of the cards, kind of setting expectations for like what just tends to be a pretty good limited card, and time again we've seen this template be pretty good. And I've been saying the word template a lot, but what I really mean is like card that kind of looks like this, right? Rune Lurker Bat, it's based off the template of Healer's Hawk back from Ravnica, Guilds of Ravnica, and that card is really good, so I would expect going forward cards that look like that to be pretty good. And that's kind of how I build my intuition for card evaluation in general. Or just like, hey, these kind of cards have been pretty good in the past. Maybe there's an exception here or there, but more times than not, these 1-mana 1/1 flyers with some abilities are pretty good. And I'm going to go back once again to efficiency. Look at what these cards are giving you. Spyglass Siren, that's so much for your 1-mana. You're getting a 1-mana 1/1 flyer, that's a pirate, for what it's worth, and a map token, so you're getting these 2 rectangles, and you can kind of see this as like 2-mana 2/2 flyer that surveils 1, or 2-mana 1/1 flyer that draws you a land, and both of those cards are fantastic. With Rune Lurker Bat, it's got flying, it's got lifelink, what's not to love, a little bit of card selection. Miner's Guidewing might look like the worst of the bunch, and I do think it is, certainly, but it's still quite good. And the thing that pushes these cards over the edge from being like pretty good to actively good in, you know, just basically any deck is the good equipment in this set. Stuff like Deconstruction Hammer, stuff like Diamond Pickaxe, stuff like the torch that deals 2 when you attack with it. All these good equipment make any evasion better, right? Because when you're equipping a creature, or when you're putting equipment on a creature, not only are you giving this +1/+1 effect to the creature, making it attack better, but you're also giving it to the lifelink on the bat, and the flying, making it, you know, a bit more power in the air. So just in general, keywords play really well with equipment, because you're actually giving those keywords to things like lifelink, things like vigilance means you're going to be able to block a little bit better. And just the game plan of, hey, I'm just getting with a bunch of my little flyers and putting equipment on them. That's a pretty good game plan in this set. So just, it's kind of twofold here. One, if these cards look not so great to you, I think just bump up in your head what a 1-mana 1/1 flyer with an ability should be in limited, how it should perform, because generally he's performed pretty well. And that added layer of, yeah, if you've got these cards in your deck, you definitely want some equipment to make their clock a little bit quicker. Because just imagine putting a Deconstruction Hammer, just +1/+1 on Rune Lurker Bat. A 2/2 flying lifelink creature is just like this massive, profound effect on the game. Any game that's about racing, that's going to be a must kill for your opponent. They simply can't win the game if you're just racing back and forth, but you're gaining 2 life per turn. Pretty quick one here for the next one, Oltec Cloud Guard. This is the 3-white, 3/2 flyer that comes in with a 1/1 gnome artifact token. And this is a pretty simple one. I think we've kind of come to know that these creatures that are pretty good, their text box is pretty good, and they come with a 1/1 friend, Chimney Rabble, Preening Champion, all these kind of cards. Really just always overperform. Like this, it's a pretty simple formula. Make 2 bodies, make one of them a 1/1, make one of them pretty good. It's hard to go wrong. And this one's no different than all those other cards that dominated those formats. So you should take it as such. I have this as the second best common, just below Waterwind Scout, which is the 3-mana 2/2 flyer that makes a map token. And I see this card going pretty late. 7th pick sometimes in some pods. And again, we're gonna kind of see in the next few weeks, things are gonna start to adjust. You're not gonna get this card as criminally late as you do now. But if you do get it late, you should take advantage of that. You should pick it up. Last card we're going to talk about today, and by no means is this the last card that I think is a little bit befuddling in this set, but the last one we're going to talk about is Inverted Iceburg. So this is 1 in a blue for an artifact. When it ETBs, you mill a card, you draw a card, and it has craft for 4 blue. Craft with an artifact. And the backside is a 6/6 that when it attacks, you can tap or untap a target creature or artifact. And there's, I think the most common thing I've heard about this card people kind of express is, well, I don't really get what it's doing in this set or just doing in general because it's a pretty aggressive set. Why do I want to play a 2-mana do nothing? Well, you can think of this as a card advantage card in a slower deck. And that's really what it's doing. It's a 2-mana artifact, but really kind of like a draw spell that draws you a card, but it also draws you another card, which is the backside, the 6-mana 6/6. And so if you just think of it as a 2-mana draw to, I think it looks a lot more appealing. There's the other part of it where it's like, well, this set's so aggressive. Like, why would you want to play this card? Just because the set is on average pretty aggressive doesn't mean all the decks are aggressive. I've drafted a lot of pretty good controlling decks. Blue-white control with crafting cards is kind of the obvious home for this. And in those decks, that's what you want to be doing. You want to be accruing value. You want to be crafting in the late game. This is perfect for that. Sure, you're not going to cast this on turn 2 every game, but that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to cast this when you would cast a draw spell. Like when you, when your hand's kind of on the board and you've defended yourself early, you've cast some removal spells, then you start to take over. And this card's very good at doing that, right? Just that rate of 2-mana draw 2, I really want to highlight that. It's an extremely good rate. Usually you get that for 3 mana. Of course, it's, the second card you draw is something specific, but that backside, that 6/6, that's going to end a lot of games. So, yeah, this is not a card for your blue-red aggro decks, although I don't think it would be terrible in there. I've played it here and there. It is for a blue-white craft deck, and it's really quite good there. All right, and that's all I have for today. Like I mentioned, we've got the State of the Format Address podcast coming up soon, probably the next day or two. If you're not familiar with those, basically that's my entire thoughts on the format. We're going to go through archetypes, big picture thoughts, just all the stuff you need to know to get you ready for your next draft. And thanks for watching. If you like this kind of video, let me know. I think I'm definitely going to do something like this in the future for future sets, because I think it's a good way to just talk about some of the sort of weird cards early on. Hope your next draft goes well, and we'll see you later. Bye, everybody.